I think turmoil has always been part of our history. I don't think we are this moment under more pressure than we have been in various moments in the past, say, 40 to 50 years. And this is important to keep in mind if you look at the relatively short history of the Gulf states. We're talking about 45, 50 years at best since their independence. And there have been a number of moments where every time we stood there and we said, oh, God, it's a turmoil, it's a disaster, where are we going to go from here, what will happen next, and so on. And all the foreign policy people started to think hard of when will be the next fall, etc. And every time there has been some outcome, not always positive, not always constructive, not always in their interest, but it has served other people's interest, marketed their trade, sold more weapons, and so on. And I'll just briefly remind you of some of those key moments, which I'm sure, as we mentioned them, all of this Daesh and everything else will be put into perspective. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 came the first big shock immediately, very close to their independence, the wave of independence in the early 70s. And that led to them, to the Gulf states, thinking, oh, well, we must all get together, and the creation of the Gulf Council in reaction to the Iranian Revolution. Of course, in those days, Iran was not about sectarianism. It was about revolution thinking, which threatened the monarchies around the region. Soon after came the Iraq-Iran war, and the perception across those small states in the Gulf that Iraq is the guarantor of security for them. There was more money pumped into Iraq. It was supported throughout its war with Iran and so on, until the next turning point, which was disastrous at the time, was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which got people to realize that, of course, we kind of backed the wrong horse in this race. He may have protected us from the Iranian expansion, but at the same time, we became a target for Saddam's policy. Now, that introduced the whole change in where do we get our security from? And brought in the United States, of course, to kick Saddam out of Kuwait into the region. They established their bases first in Saudi Arabia. And then came the next, I think, turning point is when we started to see those sort of turn in rulers within the Gulf. And the most important was, I think, when the former Emir of Qatar took power from his father, Emir Hamad, in 1995 in a bloodless coup. And in that moment, Qatar started this new trend of trying to develop their own independent thinking from Saudi Arabia. Until that moment, everybody was running within the Saudi satellite, and that was no longer the case, and Qatar was successful economically and then politically, and that has driven a lot of their ambition in terms of foreign policy. Now that continued until the next turning point, which was then a major turmoil, and that was the invasion of Iraq by the United States, which has led to the total collapse of the system, and I think then gave rise for the first time to the sectarian issues in a politicized way. Before that, there were some issues, and I'm sure colleagues on the panel will probably raise those. But 2003 up to the Arab Spring was the period where Iran was very successful in pushing its agenda in an underground way, using militias, not only in Iraq, but in Lebanon with its various wars against Israel, even within Gaza, with their support to Hamas. And in 2006 to 2009, very small but subtle support for the Houthis in Yemen. Now, all of these issues come together, and they had almost about 10 years up to the Arab Spring, where that infrastructure of intervention was laid across the region. Now, the Arab Spring came in 2010, and thrown the region yet in another wave or episode of chaos. But maybe the scale of it was very different this time. And there was a clash between people's expectations and the governments. People were looking for something very, very different. And we ended up in the scene that that you see today, with civil wars in Libya, now Yemen, Syria, Iraq continues. Lebanon is very much on the edge. And we are very concerned, of course, about Jordan today and the stability of the Gulf states as such. Now, do people see those in terms of priorities, and do they do objective analysis about a lot of these issues? I personally doubt it. We do very little internal, from within the region, reflection and analysis and prioritization, if you like, of those issues, whether it's Daesh, Iran, and so on. We, unfortunately, tend to react. We tend sometimes to overreact to some issues. We have the tendency of being driven by Western agenda in the region quite a lot. But now there is some hope that people started to see what is going on in the region in a clearer light. The fact that for the first time in a long time you have a war in the Middle East and the oil price remains steady is a big warning bells, if you like, for us to wake up and think that maybe we could just burn and nobody will care about us as a region. In the old days, there would be a war in Lebanon and the oil prices will react. Now we have the Saudi Arabia itself engaged in a war, and the world is continuing without much relevance, really, or much attention to what's going on, and there is hardly any serious effort to stop the war in Yemen. The opposite is happening with Daesh going on and so on, that there are huge envoy trips, people coming, envoys from around the world, trying to sell more and more weapons. And unfortunately, the Gulf states are responding to that with greater contracts. So it's a very interesting moment. I personally don't see it particularly exceptional at the moment, but we'll see. I'm happy to discuss this more.